You are listening to Harmony Sermons at Harmony Church in Sumter, South Carolina. We exist to see God's people become devoted, connected, and reaching, and we love the fact you decided to join in on listening to this sermon today. But we also realize that there is no substitute in connecting with others. If you have any questions about visiting church, or if we can connect you to a local church wherever you are, please visit us at harmonychurchsumter.com. Cheers, and let's begin.
Well, have you ever heard of a man named Marvin Heemeyer? Marvin moved to Granby, Colorado in the early 90s. He bought a 2-acre piece of property, built a little shop on it, and started to make his living repairing mufflers. Well, it wasn't long after that the city of Granby ordered Marvin to link his property to the local sewage system, which would have cost him $100,000, and it was going to require him to cross into land belonging to a local concrete company. Well, Marvin did not have close to that kind of money, and so he requested some help from the city, but his request was rejected by board members that had close family ties to the concrete company. In 1998, the concrete company decided to build a plant right next to Marvin's property, and when they started construction, the work blocked off the road that went from the town to Marvin's shop, and so his customers couldn't access it. So, desperate to avoid bankruptcy, Marvin bought this large bulldozer with the hopes of building or paving his own road from his town to the shop. But when he asked for permission from the city, which again had family ties to the concrete company, he was turned down. Following this, the city finally began punishing him for not building the proper sewage system, fining him $100 every day the system wasn't completed. Well, Marvin was furious, and so he took the town to court to try to resolve the issue, but he lost the case. Marvin was literally out of his mind with anger, and so he started to plot his revenge. And he took that bulldozer that he bought, and he started to fortify that thing with thick steel, even punched holes in it for guns. And Marvin took that bulldozer and he went on a rampage through town, crashing into buildings including City Hall, the concrete company, and the mayor's home. I mean, he's just going through town, destroying stuff left and right. Police tried all kinds of things to stop Marvin, but they couldn't do anything because the bulldozer was so fortified. Well, the standoff went on for hours until finally Marvin got the tread of his bulldozer stuck and wasn't able to move, and with no way out, Marvin took his own life inside the bulldozer. Now, have you ever been that mad? You ever felt like you were wrong to such an extent that you just wanted to destroy something? I'm hoping that nobody here this morning has ever felt like they were wrong to quite that extent, but I know this, there's not a single person here today that doesn't know what it's like to be wronged. There isn't one person in this room this morning that hasn't been the recipient of some kind of injustice like that. So what do you do when you're wronged? Do you lash out? Do you draw back and isolate? Do you stew and stew and stew over the issue? Maybe you gossip about and you slander the person that wronged you? Here's what I'm going to ask you to consider doing. I'm going to ask you to consider being willing to forgive the person that wronged you. And I'm going to ask you to be willing to let go of that bitterness and that resentment and anger. Basically, I'm going to ask you to consider doing one of the hardest things that you will ever have to do, to forgive somebody that has hurt you greatly. We've been in this series called Meant for Good, How Your Mess Can Become Your Ministry. We're studying the incredible story of a man named Joseph, and his story is found in Genesis chapter 45. That's where we're going to be this morning. If you have a Bible or a phone and you'd like to follow along, we'll be in Genesis 45. And remember that Joseph has quite a story. He was born into wealth. He was his father's favorite son, and that did not set well with his brothers. They were jealous of him. They hated him. And things got so bad with his brothers that they actually sold him into slavery. Joseph was taken to Egypt, an entirely different country, and he found himself working in the home of a high-ranking Egyptian official. Joseph had all kinds of leadership skills and administration skills, and before long he had worked his way up to basically serve as the house manager for this Egyptian official. Joseph was a very good-looking young man, and it wasn't long before he caught the eye of that Egyptian official's wife, and she came on to him, and he wouldn't have anything to do with her, and so she falsely accused him of rape, which landed him in prison. But once again, his leadership skills shone, and before long, he was basically running the prison under the authority of the warden. Well, through a series of events, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had this very troubling dream that he could not figure out the meaning of. And he had heard that Joseph, this Hebrew guy that was in prison, was somebody that could interpret dreams. And so he calls for Joseph, and he tells Joseph his dream, and Joseph interprets it. He says, your dream means that there's going to be 7 years of plenty here in Egypt. Crops are going to grow, there's going to be a plentiful harvest, but then there's going to be 7 years of famine. It's not going to rain, no crops are going to grow, it's going to be difficult. And so Joseph outlined a plan for Pharaoh on how they could survive the famine. And so Pharaoh takes Joseph out of prison and he makes him second in command in the entire country. And it was Joseph's job to execute this plan to get the country ready for hard times. And that's where the story picks up today, because many, many years had passed and Joseph's heartbroken father, Jacob, he was still alive. He had been lied to and said that Joseph had died years earlier. He still lived with his sons in Canaan. And they were experiencing the famine just like the Egyptians were. And so Jacob tells his sons, why don't you guys go to Egypt and see if you can buy some grain? And so they do. His brothers go to Egypt, and lo and behold, you'll never guess who they run into. Joseph. Now, they don't recognize him, but Joseph immediately recognizes them. And he kind of messes with them a little bit. He accuses them of being spies. They're terrified. In the course of the conversation, they mention to Joseph that they have a younger brother back home, and Joseph says, one of you go home and bring your brother back to Egypt. I'm going to keep the rest of you guys here until they get back. I mean, he is really laying it on thick, really messing with them. Well, the brothers are scared out of their mind, and so one of them goes back, tells Jacob what's going on, and he brings back the youngest brother to Egypt. Joseph continues to kind of mess with them a little bit. He shows them a little bit of kindness, but they're not sure what to think. They assume that at any moment, this high-ranking Egyptian official that they have no idea is their brother is going to kill them or throw them in prison. Now, what a spot Joseph is in, because all the power is now in his hands. And I'm sure that Joseph is thinking back to that day when his brothers kidnapped him and threw him into that pit, that empty well. These were guys that had to be talked out of killing him. I mean, they have messed up Joseph's life so badly, but now the tides have turned. Joseph is now the one with all the power. What would you have done if you were in Joseph's shoes? Now, some of you are here this morning, and you have been mistreated and hurt, maybe not to quite the extent that Joseph was, but you have a story. And maybe it has altered your life. Maybe it was something that happened to you years ago, and yet you're still reeling from it today. Right? It's really affected you. Maybe for you, it was abuse that you experienced. Maybe it was a legal issue that you've been drawn into, and it's just never ending. Maybe you were betrayed by somebody that you trusted. Maybe you had hurtful things said about you or hurtful things done to you. As we look at this final part of Joseph's story, here's what I want us to understand. The secret to overcoming evil involves something we know, something we do, and something we refuse to do. So, what do we know? This is what we know. Nothing comes into our lives by accident. It is either decreed or allowed by an all-wise, providential God for our good. So the story picks up here that Joseph's brothers have gone back home. They explain the situation to their father. They said, for whatever reason, this Egyptian official is demanding that we bring back our younger brother. And Jacob is like, no way. There's not a chance that I'm letting you take my youngest. He's the new Joseph. He's my favorite. I've already had one son die, and if this one dies, that would be the death of me. But eventually he consents, and they bring Joseph, the youngest brother, or they bring the youngest brother Benjamin back to Egypt with them, and they once again go before Joseph. And this is what happens. Chapter 45, look at verse 1. Joseph could no longer keep his composure in front of his attendants. So he called out, "Send everyone away from me." No one was with him when he revealed his identity to his brothers. But he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and also Pharaoh's household heard it. Now, I just want us to pause here for a second and note, Joseph ugly cried. Like, Joseph was hurt. We've been talking about this remarkable young man, and it's almost like he's like a superhero, right? He's good at everything he does. He can interpret dreams. But I just want us to notice that he is not a superhero. He hurts like we hurt. And I just want to tell you that it is okay to sit in your hurt and your grief for a bit. I think sometimes in our evangelical world, because we know how connected forgiveness is to our faith and how important it is, that sometimes when somebody hurts us, it's like, oh, you got to forgive them right now, immediately. Better do it right now. Back in 2006, some insane, evil person walked into a one-room Amish schoolhouse near Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and shot the place up, killed a bunch of people. And the next day, there were people from that community that were outside, and they were holding up signs for the killer that said, "We forgive you." I thought that was a slap in the face to those Amish people. Like, let them grieve for a minute. We'll get to the forgiveness part. But it's okay to sit in that grief and that injustice for a minute and just admit, what this person did to me hurts. What they did to me was awful. But notice how the story continues. Verse 3. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But they could not answer him because they were terrified in his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near me." And they came near. "I am Joseph, your brother," he said, "the one you sold into Egypt. And now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." Now, did you notice the wording that Joseph uses? He said, "God sent me ahead of you." He says that twice. In other words, God purposed it. God intended it. And this is the theological concept that we've been talking about in this series. It's what we call providence. And the idea of providence is that God takes care of everything He has created and He guides it toward its intended purpose. It means that God sees to all the details of your life. It's not that God looks at the mess that we've made or the mess that others have made in our lives and He comes behind us with His little God broom and kind of sweeps up the mess. No, it's that God actually purposes their evil for our good and for the good of others and for the glory of God. There is tremendous evil in this world. People can choose to do good or do evil, but God takes that evil and in some way He uses it for good. It does not remotely excuse their evil. They're going to answer to God for that one day. But the application is this: I am never a victim. There was not an ounce of victim mentality with Joseph here. Now, positionally, yes, he was wronged. And you may have been wronged as well. You may be the victim of somebody else's crime or abuse or cruelty or betrayal. But practically, I'm not going to live my life as a victim. What that person did does not get to define me. I'm not going to let them have power over me for the rest of my life. You know, God has great big plans for our lives, and the little plans of evil people to harm us are then refashioned by God for our good. In contrast to his brother's evil intentions, Joseph says this, "But God." And that little conjunction confirms and affirms the sovereign providence of God. Joseph is speaking to his brothers and he said, "Hey, you guys had intentions, but God had intentions as well. You were up to something, but God was up to something too. You had a plan, but God also had a plan." So friends, here's the good news. You can let go of the past because God has the last word, not that person who hurt you. But you have to be willing to let it go. I read this article the other day, and I almost couldn't believe it. But the article said that to use trash cans at Disney World, you now have to pay $2. That they were charging people to use trash cans. I thought, you've got to be kidding me. Article went on to explain that Disney's trying to cut down on garbage costs, and so they will charge you $2 to throw away your junk. So if you have an empty Coke can or an old hamburger wrapper and you don't want to carry it around with you all day long, you have to pay to throw it away. Well, it turns out it was a fake article. They duped me, just one of those fake news things. But I was thinking about that, and there is a cost to forgiving that person that hurt you. It will cost you something. But the trade-off is you no longer have to carry around the weight of anger and bitterness and resentment. So that's what we know. Nothing comes into our lives by accident. And because of that, I'm not going to live my life as a victim. Now, here's the second question. What do we do? What do we do? And the answer is we bless those who wrong us. The passage goes on, chapter 45, verse 9. Return quickly to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me without delay. You could settle in the land of Goshen and be near me, you, your children, and your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and all you have. There I will sustain you, for there will be 5 more years of famine. Otherwise, you, your household, and everything you have will become destitute. Look, your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin can see that I'm the one speaking to you. Tell my father about all my glory in Egypt and about all you have seen, and bring my father here quickly. Then Joseph threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept, and Benjamin wept on his shoulder. Joseph kissed each of his brothers as he wept, and afterward his brothers talked with him. I mean, just incredible kindness and grace to invite his brothers and his fathers and their families and everything they own to move to Egypt. Joseph's like, hey, we're not out of the woods yet with this famine, but I have resources. If you move here, I'll provide for you. I'll make sure that your families are provided for. What did he do? He chose to bless those who wronged him. Now, this is so interesting to me because Joseph is acting like God and showing kindness, but he is not putting himself in the position of God. Joseph has all the power in the world right here. His brothers' lives literally hang in the balance. Joseph could have done whatever he wanted. He could have killed them. He could have punished them. He could have thrown them in prison. But like God, he chose to bless them instead. Now, friends, that is the call of Jesus on our lives when we've been hurt. And see, when we do this, we are reflecting the gospel. Christians are people that choose to deal with others the way that God deals with us. We show people our favor and we absorb their debt. Because see, when somebody wrongs you, there is a debt that is accrued. There's an emotional debt. And what happens is we often try and make that person pay us down the debt. We do it by trying to get back at them. We give them the silent treatment. We gossip about them. We slander them. Maybe even in some cases, we even try to physically hurt them. And we think that by doing this, it takes away some of the emotional pain that they caused us. And guess what? Can a pastor be honest this morning? It does, right? It feels good when somebody that has wronged you is then hurt. But that's not what a Christian does. A Christian is somebody that absorbs the debt himself. You know, we talk about forgiving a debt, but a debt can't really be forgiven. It can only be absorbed by somebody else. Maybe somebody should tell our government that. Anyways, that's not part of the sermon. Think about it this way. If I run into you at Chick-fil-A, right? We're in line together, and I place my order, and I reach in my back pocket to grab my wallet, and I realize that I've left my wallet at home, I forgot it, and you're like, oh, hey, don't worry about it. I got it. I'll cover you. And you pay for my meal, and then the next time I see you, I try to give you that $8 or $10 or whatever it was, and you're like, don't worry about it. Not a problem. What happened there? You absorbed that debt. You will never see that $10 again. You took the loss on yourself. Now, that's not a big deal to do with $10, but that is very, very painful to do emotionally. But friends, that's what Jesus has done for us. He took our debt that we owed him on himself. And now, if you are a Christian here this morning, there's only one way that God can deal with you, and it's out of his favor. It's out of his goodness. And it's out of that truth that we choose to deal with others that have hurt us the same way that God deals with us. And so what is the application? The application is this: I will do good to those who hurt me. In a safe, appropriate way, I will look to do good to that person that wronged me and hurt me. Now, this means that I'm going to do the hard work of praying for that person that hurt me. And oh my goodness, that is so difficult and hard. But you know what? It's really hard to stay bitter at somebody that you're praying for. This means that I'm going to refuse to treat that person like they don't exist. Because that's the normal way to deal with somebody when they wrong you and hurt you greatly, right? You hurt me, you said that about me, you did that to me, we're done, we're through, right? In my eyes, you no longer exist. This means that I'm going to look for practical ways to bless that person. Now, I'm going to be wise, I'm going to be safe in how I do it, and in some cases, you aren't going to be able to have a relationship with that person again. Sometimes people do things that are so harmful and so damaging that things can't go back to the way that they were. And so this doesn't mean that we excuse what they did, and it doesn't mean that we don't pursue justice, even legal justice. But because I am a Christian and because I believe in God's providence, I know that God is working behind the scenes just like he was with Joseph. And so I understand that there might be more riding on this situation than just my life and my happiness. Maybe God intends to take this wrong that was done against me and use my godly, gracious response to that wrong to impact others just like he did with Joseph. So what do we know? We know that nothing comes into our lives by accident. What do? We bless those who wrong us. And then thirdly, what do we refuse to do? And the answer is we refuse to take revenge. Jump over, if you would, to chapter 50. And notice what it says, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said to one another, this is after they've moved down to Egypt, if Joseph is holding a grudge against us, he will certainly repay us for all the suffering we caused him. So they sent this message to Joseph. Before he died, your father gave a command. Say this to Joseph, please forgive your brothers' transgressions and their sin, the suffering they caused you. Therefore, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when their message came to him. His brothers also came to him, bowed down before him, and said, we are your slaves. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me. You meant it for evil, Joseph says. But God planned it for good, to bring about the present result, the survival of many people. Therefore, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Now, the brothers have grown a little bit. They understand, they get the severity of what they did to Joseph. Did you see what they said at the end of verse 18? We are your slaves. They're like, Joseph, we owe you a debt that we cannot repay. And I love Joseph's response. He said, am I in the place of God? Friends, that is a question that you are going to have to ask yourself when you are wronged. Am I going to put myself in the position of God the judge? Or am I going to treat this person that hurt me the way that God treats me? And so here's the application. I will choose to offer forgiveness to those who hurt me. See, Joseph understood, I am not the judge here. I'm not in the place of God. And instead of paying them back, he showed kindness to them. Friends, this is what God is calling you to do. Now, this, again, does not mean that we can't pursue justice. It doesn't mean that we can't find satisfaction when they get the justice that was coming to them. But forgiveness keeps our offender from becoming our mental and emotional jailer. Can that person that hurt you greatly, can they run through your mind without you mentally murdering them? See, sometimes this whole forgiveness thing is a process. We like to think of forgiveness as like a one-time event. But what I found to be true in my life is that it is typically a process. I have to make the decision to forgive, and then I might have to do it again. And I might have to do it again and again and again. Friends, one day, just like Joseph, there's a very good chance that you will have power over the person that wronged you or hurt you or abused you or stole your childhood or hurt you financially. And in that moment, you are going to remember exactly what they did to you. And in that moment, God is going to ask you to remember something else. Who was with you? Who was with you in that pain? Who was with you in the middle of that injustice? And you're going to have a decision to make. Am I going to pay them back, or am I going to pave the way forward? Now, this is almost impossible, what we are being asked to do here. It's not a big deal to forgive somebody when they've wronged you in a little way. But some of you have been wronged in very, very big ways, and God is calling on you to offer forgiveness to that person. That is like next to impossible. How do you do it? Well, friends, what we're being called to do here is only possible through the power of what we call the gospel. And the gospel is the good news that even though we have done all this wrong against God, instead of punishing us, God sent his Son to be punished in our place. And all of the wrath and all of the punishment that should have been poured out on us for what we have done to God, it was poured out on Jesus in our place, and God offers us forgiveness. I want to invite the worship team to come back up. One of the most powerful stories that I've ever heard about forgiveness is the story of Corrie ten Boom in her book, The Hiding Place. I know I've shared this story before, but I think this is too powerful of a story to not revisit every once in a while. Corrie ten Boom, if you don't know who she was a young girl that lived with her family in Holland at the start of World War II. And when the Nazis started occupying Holland, the ten Boom family would secretly house Jews and protect them and keep them from being sent away to concentration camps. Well, they were sold out and betrayed and turned on by a friend. And the family was taken away and sent to concentration camps themselves. Corrie and her sister Betsy were sent to a camp called Ravensbrück, and her sister died there. Well, fast forward to 1947, Corrie had been released from Ravensbrück, and she goes back to Germany to preach the forgiveness of God to the German people. And she tells this really moving story. She says, "It was at a church in Munich that I saw him, a balding, heavy-set man in a gray overcoat. He had a brown felt hat clutched between his hands. People were filing out of the basement where I had just spoke and moving along the rows past the wooden chairs toward the door at the rear. It was 1947, and I had come from Holland to defeated Germany with a message that God forgives. That's when I saw him, working his way forward against the others as they were filing out. One moment I saw the overcoat and the brown hat. The next moment, a blue uniform and a visored cap with the skull and crossbones on it. It all came back with a rush. The huge room with its harsh overhead lights. The pathetic pile of dresses and shoes in the center of the room. The shame of walking naked past this leering man. I could see my sister's frail form ahead of me, ribs sharp beneath the parchment skin. The place was Ravensbrück, and the man who was making his way toward me in the basement of that church had been my guard, one of the most cruel guards. Now he was in front of me, his hand thrust out. A fine message, Fraulein. How good it is, as you say, that all our sins are cast at the bottom of the sea. And I, who had spoken so glibly of forgiveness, fumbled in my pocketbook rather than take his hand. He would not remember me, of course. How could he remember one prisoner out of all those thousands of executed women? But I remembered him, and the leather crop swinging from his belt. I was face to face with one of my captors, and my blood froze. You mentioned Ravensbrück in your talk. I was a guard there. But since that time, I have become a Christian. I know that God has forgiven me for all the cruel things that I did there, but I would like to hear it from your lips as well, Fraulein. Again, the hand came out. Will you forgive me? And I stood there, me whose sins again and again had been forgiven by God, but I could not forgive. Betsy died in that place. Could he erase her slow, terrible death simply for the asking? It could not have been many seconds that he stood there with his hand out, but to me it seemed like hours as I wrestled with the most difficult thing that I would ever have to do. I stood there with coldness clutching my heart. Listen to this. Forgiveness is not an emotion. Forgiveness is an act of the will. And the will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart. Jesus, help me, I prayed. I can lift my hand, I can do that much, but you must supply the feeling, Jesus. And so, woodenly, mechanically, I stretched out my hand to the one who stretched out to me. And as I did, an incredible thing took place. The current started in my shoulder. It raced down my arm. It sprang into our joined hands. And then this healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. I forgive you, brother, I cried. With all my heart, I forgive you. For a long moment, we grasped each other's hands, the former guard and the former prisoner. I have never known God's love so intensely as I did then. But even then, I realized it was not my love. I had tried and did not have the power. This was the power of the Holy Spirit. Now, some of you are here this morning and you are thinking back to all those ways that you have been hurt and wronged. And some of you right now do not have the feeling to forgive. And I get it. I've been there too many, many times. And so here's what I do when somebody hurts me and I have a really hard time letting go of it. I clench my fist and I tell God exactly what that person did to me, and I tell God exactly how I'm feeling about it. But then I open my hands and I pray something like this, and I would ask you to bow your heads. And if you are struggling to forgive, maybe you'd like to pray this prayer along with me. God, I release this person from what they did to me. I'm trusting that you will bring the justice that's deserved. Thank you for forgiving me and absorbing my sin debt. Please give me the feelings that I don't currently have. I want to obey you, and I want to be free. And I pray all of this in the name of the crucified Savior who died that I might be forgiven.